Every year, around 140,000 vessels call at one port. It handles more than 37 million containers. It is the world's largest bunkering hub. More ships refuel here than anywhere else on Earth. Singapore is a city-state with no natural resources, no agricultural land to speak of, and a population of about 6 million people. And yet, it sits at the center of a logistics network that connects virtually every major economy on the planet. If you wanted to design, from scratch, the most strategically important port in the world, you would end up with something that looks a lot like this. This is how that happened, and why it matters more than most people realize. I'm the host of Supply Chain Daily. I cover the systems and choke points of global trade from inside the industry. Singapore is one of those topics that supply chain professionals think about constantly and that almost everyone else takes completely for granted. It is the node that everything else routes through, and most people have never considered what would happen if it didn't work. Let's get into it. Singapore sits at the eastern exit of the Strait of Malacca, the most important shipping lane on Earth, which we covered in a previous episode. Every ship coming from the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, or Europe and heading to East Asia passes within range of Singapore. Every ship going the other way passes it again. The port's location is not a coincidence. It is the entire explanation. The Port of Singapore Authority, PSA, is among the most operationally efficient port operators in the world. Vessel turnaround times, crane productivity, yard management, by almost every benchmark, Singapore sets the standard. For shipping lines, that efficiency has real monetary value. A ship that spends 18 hours in Singapore instead of 30 hours saves fuel, crew time, and scheduling buffer. Multiply that across thousands of calls per year and the savings are enormous. The port's throughput, currently around 37 million TEU per year, makes it the world's second busiest container port by volume. But raw volume understates its importance. A large proportion of what moves through Singapore is transshipment cargo. Goods that arrive on one vessel are moved through the terminal and depart on a different vessel bound for a different destination. Singapore is the hub at the center of a regional spoke network that serves hundreds of smaller ports across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific. If Singapore's port stopped working for a week, the knock-on disruption across the Asia-Pacific supply chain would be immediate and severe. There is no port in the region with the capacity and connectivity to absorb even a fraction of that volume at short notice. Singapore's strategic position was recognized almost immediately after Sir Stamford Raffles established a British trading post there in 1819. The island was chosen specifically for its deep natural harbor and its location at the junction of trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Raffles declared it a free port, no duties on goods transiting through, and trade exploded almost instantly. Within a decade, it was one of the busiest ports in the British Empire. The Japanese occupation of Singapore from 1942 to 1945 demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that whoever controls this port controls the access routes to most of Southeast Asia. When Singapore fell, Allied supply lines to Burma, India, and the Pacific were fundamentally disrupted. The strategic lesson was not lost on the generation that built modern Singapore. When Singapore became independent in 1965, unexpectedly, after separation from Malaysia, the new government under Lee Kuan Yew made a deliberate decision. This small island with no resources would live by trade. Port infrastructure, logistics capabilities, and connectivity would be national priorities, not just economic ones. PSA was professionalized, corporatized, and given long-term mandates to invest in infrastructure that wouldn't pay off for decades. The result, 50 years later, is a port that handles cargo from over 600 ports in 120 countries and territories. That did not happen by accident. It happened because a government decided, at the moment of its own birth, that logistics was a strategic asset and invested accordingly. There are 3 things Singapore does that most ports don't, and understanding them explains why it's so difficult to replicate. First, transshipment at scale. Singapore doesn't just handle cargo going to Singapore, it handles cargo going everywhere. Goods arrive from Europe on a large vessel, are offloaded, sorted, and reloaded onto smaller feeder vessels that then distribute them to ports in Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and dozens of other destinations. This transshipment model requires enormous yard capacity, sophisticated IT systems, and, critically, a very large number of shipping line services calling at the port so that connections are always available. Singapore has that critical mass. Most ports don't. Second, bunkering. Singapore is the world's largest bunkering port by volume, selling over 50 million tons of marine fuel per year. For a vessel operator, Singapore is the natural refueling stop for Asia-Pacific voyages. The range of fuel types available: conventional heavy fuel oil, low-sulfur fuels, and increasingly LNG and methanol, is unmatched in the region. Bunkering is not just a service that ships need, it is a gravitational force that pulls ships to Singapore even when their cargo could theoretically be transshipped elsewhere. Third, the ecosystem. Singapore is not just a port, it's a maritime financial center. Ship finance, marine insurance, commodity trading, shipbroking, and maritime law are all concentrated there. For a vessel owner, having your financing, your insurance, your chartering, and your port operations all accessible in one city with a reliable legal system and a stable currency is enormously valuable. This concentration of services reinforces the port's position in a way that pure terminal capacity cannot. The Tuas megaport, currently under construction on Singapore's western coast, will eventually consolidate all of the island's container operations into a single facility with capacity for around 65 million TEU per year. That is nearly double the current throughput. It is the largest port development project currently underway anywhere in the world. From inside the supply chain, Singapore is the benchmark that everything else is measured against. Port productivity, IT integration, customs clearance speed. When a client asks me why their goods moved faster through Singapore than through another major port, the answer is almost always because PSA invested in the infrastructure to make that possible, and they've been investing in it for 50 years. The COVID period illustrated this very clearly. In 2021, port congestion cascaded across the global container network. LA and Long Beach backed up for months. South AMP Tun, Rotterdam, and FEE Lixto all experienced significant delays. Singapore experienced congestion too. It was impossible to be entirely immune, but it recovered faster and more completely than almost any comparable port, because the underlying infrastructure and management systems had the capacity to absorb the shock. The thing that concerns supply chain practitioners about Singapore is not its current performance. It's what happens if the geopolitical environment in Southeast Asia deteriorates. Singapore is a small, wealthy, highly connected city-state in a neighborhood that includes countries of very different political alignments. It has maintained its position through decades of careful neutrality and excellent relationships with both the United States and China. If those relationships ever became mutually exclusive, if Singapore were forced to choose, the ripple effects through global logistics would be significant. For now, Singapore's position looks stable, but the industry watches the regional political environment because the port's commercial neutrality is as important as its physical infrastructure. This is Supply Chain Daily, the systems and nodes of global trade explained from inside the industry. New video every Thursday and Saturday. Subscribe if this kind of analysis is useful to you. And if you've worked in Singapore in port operations or in the maritime services sector, drop your perspective in the comments. I read everything. Until next time, keep an eye on what's moving.